Hi, everyone, and welcome. This is going to be a short live stream today where we're going to be talking about Q by Example, which is a new content venue that we've created for the Q project. And we're going to explain what Q by Example is, most importantly, actually walk through an example of contributing to Q by Example. So let's get straight into it. By way of brief introduction, my name is Paul. I work full-time on the Q project. And as is shown on the slide here, I've also contributed to the Go project in the past. Today, Jonathan is going to be presenting with me, and I'll let him introduce himself now.
Hey, I'm Jonathan Matthews. I am a technical operations specialist, sysadmin, DevOps, operations gopher, if you will. I'm really keen on Q because it solves so many of the problems that I'm used to dealing with, but I think that we've got a whole different set of examples and things that we need to get out there in front of people to show them the sort of problems that it can solve with Q. So that's why I'm really happy to be here helping Paul talk through this today.
Folks, keen observers might recognize Jonathan from an earlier live stream we did in the year, where Jonathan and I actually talked through how to use Q and Terraform together. That's a really good example of sort of Q being used in the wild, and Q by Example really builds on that kind of idea for sort of system or application specific examples. So let's crack on. So what is Q by Example? Perhaps best explained by looking at what qlang.org is and isn't today. The current qlang.org, as we talked about before, suffers from a lack of content, a lack of examples, far too theoretical in places, difficult to search, and it's not particularly community driven either. And that sort of points to a number of problems, not only those specific ones listed there, but also that it's perhaps not got quite the right focus or a clear enough focus. So the idea is really that we split qlang.org into two different content venues. Alpha.qlang.org, as we've also previously discussed, is going to be converted to be qlang.org when that gets finished and polished in a couple of ways. And Q by Example is this new venue that we're going to talk a bit about today, which is more community driven and very much more focused on solutions, use cases, and sort of experiments that use Q in the wild in practical situations. So just a refresher there then that alpha.qlang.org, as we said, which is going to become the new qlang.org, is really then going to focus on documentation. That's really going to allow us to sort of present foundational how-tos, tutorial, concept guides, reference material, whatever it might be. That's going to be very carefully reviewed and maintained by the Q team, because what we're then intending is that is foundational learning material. It'll be tied to a specific Q version so that we guarantee that whatever piece of documentation you're reading actually works with the given Q version. But as such, we need to be a tiny bit careful because we can't really then start delving into lots of different apps and systems, because otherwise the purpose of qlang.org gets a bit blurred. So focus really on core Q documentation. Contributions very much welcome, and as we see off the right hand side there, the two repositories that are behind qlang.org are the docs and content repo, which is where we're tracking content ideas and discussion around those ideas, and then q-lang.org, which is the actual source behind the website itself. So not only the infrastructure, but also the markdown files that are behind each of the pages and everything.
So if qlang.org is going to be agnostic to different apps, different systems, does that mean that we're not going to see any form of any specifics on there and how to integrate Q with technologies? And if we're not, where are we going to see those things?
That's a good question. So it would be very dry, I think, if we just did purely hypothetical or abstract examples on qlang.org. And so what you will see is we'll lean on real world situations, for examples of schemas, for example, or examples of where you might use policy, for example, and we'll reference those. So it won't be purely in the abstract in that situation, but we won't have end-to-end guides. Let's just take GitHub Actions, for example. We won't be placing an end-to-end guide on how to use Q to drive GitHub Actions on qlang.org, because really that raises the question of, well, what about other CI systems? Which places QLang.org in a bit of a tricky situation of, should we really be hosting content for all the CI CD systems out there? And that then starts to detract from that core mission of, well, helping people with those foundational learning blocks of what do you need to learn Q-wise to actually get started, right? And so the focus shifts a tiny bit too much. So we will have practical examples there, but they won't be end to end. And so that, just to answer your question specifically, that new venue is therefore going to be Q by example. And so this is where we're going to see those use cases, solutions, experiments, whatever they might be around the use of Q. So some of these are going to be more mature than others, and we'll get into a demo in a second. For example, using Q to drive GitHub Actions is actually quite a mature example. We use it heavily in the Q project itself. And so these are very much more hands-on example-led content pieces. We're very much hoping for this to be community-driven, with folks sharing their ideas, experiments, etc., of where Q is used. Oops, excuse me, I've gone forward a slide too quickly there. The structure of Q by example, as we'll see in a second, is a bit of an experiment itself. Doing all of this in a GitHub repo is a very quick and easy way to bootstrap and just to remain nice and dynamic based on feedback that we get on what's the best way of structuring these things. Probably time for us to move to a demo, Jonathan, if that's good.
Absolutely.
Wait, can I interject a quick question there?
Yeah, please do.
Is there any thinking around specific case studies? I know we want to keep things general for documentation, but there's kind of that middle ground of like seeing what specific things people have done. You can dive deeper into those details, like what's the trade-off versus CI systems, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that sort of falls a bit more clearly into content that the Q open source project or Q Labs can be responsible for and maintaining, right? And so I think one of the tricky parts is this: who's maintaining the piece of content, right? And with Q, one of the nice things about Q is that it can be used in lots of different situations. That's a double-edged sword, though, because then maintaining those bits of documentation in those different systems, Jonathan made an excellent point in this respect, is that the Q version moves along at a particular pace, but the version of the system or tools, etc., that you might be using in such a guide can be going along at 2 or 3 times the pace there. And so actually ensuring that guide is sort of up to date and relevant and accurate is actually quite a tricky thing. And I think this is where we need maintainers of those systems or users in those different communities to help in that respect, to maintain the content. But when it comes to specific use cases, I think that is something that the Q team can help to own, because really they are like sort of key pieces that should help to give people comfort on the use of Q, for example. So again, from the ownership perspective, the Q team plus whatever project or partner is involved in that situation, I think we jointly look to take ownership of that and be responsible for it being up to date, etc. So I think in that situation, it's probably a bit clearer that we should be having those use cases on QLang.org, for example, because those bits of content have sort of got a much clearer owner in that situation.
I think this also will become easier as the language becomes more mature, hit 1.0, and we build those toolings like, Q is good at rewriting itself just because it's there. So yeah,
that's a very good point too. So it should be the case that Q is self-healing, exactly as you say. In some situations it won't be. But Jonathan, I come back and it was a brilliant observation where Jonathan said, well, the Q might be fine, but the system you're actually using might have moved on a couple of versions, at which point whatever guide it is has sort of bit rotted a tiny bit.
And it's also about that, because that cadence can change. Should the Q project have the burden of keeping those bits of documentation up to date across sort of that matrix of the different Q versions, the different third-party technology versions, and keeping abreast of every minute bit? That seems like an awfully big lift for something that could sit in more of a Q example. Sorry, a Q by example text.
Yeah, I think the Q team would probably have to put some constraints on what they're going to maintain, but I think the tooling should help. I mean, that's one of the big
Yeah.
benefit the queue. So
Yeah, definitely so. Should we go to demo, Jonathan?
Let's do it. I'll take
Perfect.
over sharing now.
Please do. I'll leave my screen shared, but shouted that.
Cool. Let me know if mine's coming through okay.
Yeah, looks good to me.
GitHub's repo. So this is Q-BioExample. It's a public repo, and we can see, let's have a look at what we've actually got sitting around in Q-BioExample. So at the moment, we've got an index sitting at the top level, pointing towards some of these numerically prefixed bits of content, guides, I think we would reasonably call them.
Mhm.
And so we can see from that, we've got driving GitHub Actions, we've got writing Terraform plan policies, we've got a bit of Kubernetes, we've got some Mythic Beast DNS zones. Let's just have a quick look through a couple. We've got driving GitHub Actions, by Jonathan Matthews, that bit. So I put this one together, and you'll notice that we are doing attribution on these. So that's something that folks really, I think is really important to folks to stick on their own, not to do with my content, but to do with everybody's content.
Completely agree. I'll just jump in there, Jonathan. Completely agree. It's this is also true on alpha.qlang.org as well. We want to make sure, and if folks see any content on, they'll see Jonathan's name against a number of pieces there as well. It's highly important to the Q project that those people who are contributing sort of see that actually manifested in the right places, because a little too often it can just get buried a tiny bit in the commit author, and that's not prominent enough in our view. So in this situation, Jonathan has started this piece of content, based it on another a live stream that we actually did, but to all intents and purposes, this is Jonathan's work here, so we're reflecting that here.
I for one hope that this gets evolved and kept up to date as GitHub Actions itself evolves, and my name, other names get added to it, and eventually my name gets taken off it because Ship of Theseus, it's no longer the content I wrote. But I think that's really important for folks to be able to stamp their name on it. Again, not from my perspective, just to show the range of folks who are going to be writing these sorts of things to do really cool things with Q. So this is a GitHub Actions based one. We'll come on to a little bit of what we're seeing in guides in a moment. Stepping onto another one that you saw in the index, we've got the venerable
Kubernetes tutorial.
Kube tutorial. Obviously, this is by the Q project. This is, I think, would it be fair to say, Paul, that this is now sort of the canonical location of this doc rather than the markdown that's sitting around in the Q?
Yeah, I think so. And what we're going to do is actually retire the Kubernetes tutorial from the main repo itself, not least because it's a bit of a test burden in the main repo, but also that this really then is the proper place for a tutorial like this. It's a solutions piece like any other. And so sort of leading by example, we carve this out of the main repo and we just link to it from the main repo. We just say, and if you're interested in the Kubernetes tutorial, it's moved here. And then we just link to Q-BioExample, and we do the same. We do the same sort of from qlang.org in those situations where there's good third-party content. And third-party content is therefore things like Q-BioExample that we want to link to. Q-BioExample would be one such piece.
So that's sort of the scope of the things that are there at the moment. But what else have we got that can be useful? Well, we're really thinking about folks trying to contribute here.
Yep.
And we've got a couple of docs here which are really important and useful. The first is the style guide. And the style guide really just, as the name implies, it shows you the style, the form, the formatting that we'd like folks to put in there, because consistency is really useful and helpful for folks who might be reading more than one doc. It also really helps to sort of establish sort of language, consistency of language across things perhaps over time. But we can't really mandate that to begin with. So what we're doing is just writing down, right, well, what we'd like some sort of some H1s, we'd like some attribution at the top here, we'd like some H2s, H3s, H4s to just be the sorts of sections that it makes sense for people to jump between.
Just to jump in briefly here, Jonathan, we've talked about this being experimental in structure, and this style guide should also be considered like experimental in its guidance as well. But we need to start somewhere.
Yes.
And so this is really a straw man in terms of the structure. And the idea here was really, Kelsey Hightower talks a lot about the brilliant example that DigitalOcean and other such content venues have created by means of a sort of an example to follow. And that's really what we're aspiring to here, following Kelsey's suggestion that actually, you really should try and, as you suggested, Jonathan, introduce some consistency. So folks are used to the flow of something. They open a doc, they're used to, all right, fine. So here's the introduction, here's the prerequisites, whatever it might be. It's easy to read. It just falls off the page for them. And so really learning from the example of sites like DigitalOcean and Kelsey's suggestion that actually that's a really good pattern to follow. It makes it easy to read, but it also makes it easier to contribute when folks can see, oh, this is the style. And I think you're going to show us a template as well, Jonathan, for like a quick, easy start here too.
Indeed, the style guide goes through and demonstrates a few things like we have a file prefix, the preamble that we think makes it easier for folks to know when they're being expected to drop a file on disk, and shell command blocks and folding files, etc. But the style guide itself isn't particularly easy to pick up and edit and adapt. So we've put together a separate one, a template, which is something where you absolutely could just pick this file up and blat out the words and put the words in there that you want to see and do relevant to your content. So this thing here, this template is absolutely designed to be copy it, adapt it, and as
good skeleton.
Open a PR.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Good.
Good call. So the flow of actually making changes here, obviously, if someone wants to come along and write an awesome piece of doc and PR it in there, fantastic. But we think it also makes sense if we start with issues. That way we can sort of coordinate a little bit of not having 10 different bits of people working on the same sort of thing. And so that's what I did earlier. And I opened let's have something about GitLab CI/CD pipelines, thinking that it's quite similar to the GitHub Actions guide, but for GitLab. So that's an idea if you're looking for a bit of content to perhaps open up with. Have a skim through the issues. I know that we've got discussions enabled here. I don't know that we've got a particularly solid idea of what we want the discussions to sit as. Maybe it's feedback. Maybe it's more widely scoped ideas of content classes that might make sense. But I think
we're holding it all very lightly at the moment, and so it's really just for us to discover kind of what works best. Here we've got some examples of content ideas. We're just going to keep adding to this. As you can see, we've populated this relatively recently since we started the experiment. We're going to continue to create content from our side, and so we'll follow that best practice of just creating an issue to signal to folks that we're doing content piece X, Y, or Z. But otherwise, folks should just feel free to turn up and submit a drive-by PR. Totally fine. We don't need that coordination. It's just can help in some situations to give ideas to folks as much as anything else as to what we're doing.
Yeah, I've certainly got a bunch of things. I want to stick some ideas in there that I probably haven't got time to sit down and write, but I think would be really useful for folks, certainly my sort of ops setting.
Yep.
As an example, GitLab CI/CD pipelines. I open that issue because I can see a very strong mirror between it and the GitHub Actions guide.
Mm-hmm.
Now, just being a person without any sort of additional rights there, I needed to fork the repo. So I forked it over here. And you can see here, I've actually made some changes. I've put in my work in progress bit of a doc here. And
so what we're looking at here, Jonathan, is a branch, presumably,
yes,
where you've created a commit with a change, and you've, by the looks of things, made a change to the top level README there as part of. So we're viewing the GitHub rendering in this situation of that branch.
Absolutely, yes. We are looking at a branch into which I've actually pushed changes around the top level index, including my document within that,
mm-hmm.
and also and
there's the directory that contains the piece of content. Great. Mm-hmm.
And actually the the document itself. So I've written up that idea. I'd now like to get that included upstream. As with many things in a GitHub land, I'm probably going to PR that. So let's.
So we're pretending here for those folks following along. Jonathan's pretending like he's making his first contribution to Qbyexample here. So this is the flow we're going in. He's had this great idea. He was really good to actually create the issue in the first place, so as to coordinate, and everyone's clear that he's working on it. 10 out of 10 so far.
So next, I'm going to open a PR for it,
Right.
the flow that we've got. So I think that the comment that I've added as the commit message is actually sufficiently good enough. I'm not going to add anything to this before I open it. I've marked in that it closes my issue. I've linked in a few bits that it contains. I've pointed out a Q bug that I opened while I was going through this. And that's going to be in the commit message itself. And I don't think I need to actually amend that in terms of this.
It's a nice little story, because for someone just looking at the commits and therefore the commit message, they get a very good high level. First of all, they've got the top line there, driving GitHub CI/CD pipelines with Q, and then a nice little story as to what this content piece is actually about, therefore what's in the change. I like it.
So let's create that pull request. It's automatically gone over to the canonical upstream repo. And there we go. Okay, so Paul, I need you to tell me, as the person sort of in charge of this, as a Q project person in charge of this repo, I need you to tell me the numeric prefix I'm going to use, because I put WIP work in progress for them, because I didn't get a number from you to begin with. It's not sort of set up like that. But just before we stick it in, I need to know that number. So could you reply back, giving me a
sure thing?
Do please.
I'm going to reply in the PR, if that makes sense.
Yep.
To which I've just done, say 005. And I think that you just highlighted a key point there, is that what we want to do as well is, for the, right now, the Q team are helping to drive this forward, review bits of content coming in. We absolutely want to get more people on board reviewing this content as well, and helping to approve it and get the content just flowing through. So as and when folks are keen, start making contributions, etc., we're really happy. Much like the Go project delegates responsibility for issue gardening and approval of changes to the Go project, we absolutely want to do the same here. So as folks like Jonathan and others want to contribute more, it's sort of then clear, someone sort of and like in all sort of open source contributions, it's clear that they're keen, able, stepping up to the plate in terms of doing these reviews. We'll absolutely start delegating that, so we don't create a bottleneck. That's absolutely what we want to avoid in this situation.
So one sort of bottleneck that does exist at the minute is that you, as one of those people shepherding this pull, need to be the person to merge it, where I shouldn't be able to see the rebase and merge button at the moment, but that shouldn't be there, but it should be there. So if you can...
So I've just approved it, and then from my side, I'm just going to say rebase and merge. So Jonathan should see they look good to me, as he does on the screen. And now I'm just going to rebase and merge this. So that should now be live.
So let's check that it is live. Back onto the main branch here. And here we go. We've got 005 driving that. I hope I've renamed it correctly. Yes, I have.
Great.
So we've now got this bit of content live in there, ready for folks to be able to come and point out the things that I've got wrong with GitLab CI. I'm sure.
I think we clearly did a bit of this may be a UK specific phrase here. We did a Blue Peter, which is here's one I prepared earlier. I'm sure that that probably translates into other idioms elsewhere. So we did gloss over quite a bit there in terms of the actual writing of the piece of content itself, Jonathan. But I think the style guide and the template should be great starting points for folks who want to actually get up and running with things nice and quickly.
Absolutely.
So we're all good.
I think that's the end of the sort of the showing what we're doing in terms of the getting the content in there. Paul, back over to you.
Yeah, do you want to stop sharing your screen, Jonathan, and maybe that will automatically reshare mine? We'll see.
Will it reshare?
Or no, it doesn't. Okay, let me try that. I'll start again. I'm not quite sure how to drive that.
I swear they change how Google Meet works every couple of days.
Okay, so let's just quickly move into some FAQs, Q&As. Here's some questions we prepared earlier as well, really just so that we didn't front load too much of this information. So Jonathan talked there about how we know what number to use as a directory prefix. Honestly, we're open to better ideas on how to coordinate that. But for now, it's a bit experimental in terms of how we get up and running. If we find it's a major bottleneck that people are colliding on numbers, that's probably a good problem to have. We can solve that down the line. But for now, just keep it a bit scrappy in that respect. We talked briefly about what does experimental mean as well. It's very much more the structure of the repository is a bit experimental. We're very much open to feedback from folks on how we could do this better and differently. And I might actually at this point sort of talk about question number 5. Which sort of what are the longer term plans do we have for this content? It's really for us to make as much of this as we absolutely can, and try and get as many folks in the Q community contributing to this as well. Because the more content that we can have being driven through this site and the more eyes we can get on it, then the more ideas we get for Q, the more sort of good feedback we get on what's working well for Q, what's not working well, and the more that we sort of learn from each other in good ways that Q can be applied as well. So even though it's marked as experimental, we've seen some pretty mature content in there in terms of the GitHub actions being driven by Q. We've been doing that for at least 3 or 4 years. Yes, there are some things that we could improve about that, but the content itself is actually quite quite mature and stable. That was the word I was after in that situation.
As well as the Coop one, obviously representing almost perhaps one of the most mature elements in that context.
Yep. Question 3, what is the bar for contributing? As in, are we expecting a particular quality of content or anything? This is the whole idea. This is very much a discovery process here that we're going through. Again, sort of back to that experimental word. We don't have the answer on the best way to present all of this. And we're very much hoping that folks bringing these different examples of how and where Q can be used can really help us to then shape the way in which this content should be structured. So again, back to the longer term plans for this content again, is that you can sort of imagine one way, Jonathan, we could stick a very simple static site on top of this GitHub repo with an Algolia or similar kind of search interface to make it easy to actually navigate it, with some nice automatic indexing, perhaps as part of the static site. That would be an easy lift to sort of, but let's go step by step. Let's create some content first of all, and then we can easily spin up a site a bit further down the line.
For that bar that you're talking about the contribution, does that mean that if I've got some content that I think might be a good idea, might work, but maybe I haven't got a context in which I can actually prove it out? In other words, not only the structure, but the actual content itself is a bit on the experimental, hey, I reckon this would be useful. Something that perhaps I might throw out as a blog post somewhere.
Yep.
Is that suitable to come in here? Are we
100%? 100%. Let's just take an example of something. Folks might not have understood the company name Mythic Beasts behind one of the bits of content that's already listed there. Mythic Beasts is actually, they're based in the UK, but they are global as a hosting and DNS provider. And they've got an absolutely fabulous API for managing DNS. We, as the Q project, we moved a number of our domains and DNS setup to Porkbun, which is another domain. What do they call domain? I forget the name of them. Domain registry. And they also do their own DNS as well. However, we haven't had quite so much fun working with Porkbun's DNS API in that situation. And so we've been working with Jonathan on a piece of content that explores how to drive Porkbun's DNS API using Q. And it does require quite a bit more work. And so in that situation, I would definitely class that as a very experimental piece of content, not least because it only does perhaps 10% of the story of managing DNS with Porkbun. It only really handles the migration to Porkbun, and then we've got a bit of a gap. So even in that situation, I'd say that's a piece of content that's sort of worthy of publishing with a sort of perhaps a health warning in the guide itself that says this is incomplete and really we want help filling out the rest of it here, I'd say that's totally legitimate, just as long as we're sort of people are being clear on quite how stable / mature a piece of content actually is. So yeah, completely. If folks have content that they already have in their blog posts where they've been using Q to drive network management software or actual network devices themselves, totally. Whatever it might be, all good, all examples welcome. Question number 4, what if I spot an error in a piece of content? Just dig in, submit a PR, submit a fix. Again, this is in contrast to the qlang.org site. So on the qlang.org site, every piece of content there will be automatically tested, really because we won't be able to manually test every piece of content on qlang.org when we make changes to Q itself. It would just be a burden we wouldn't wish on anybody. But in this situation, because again, we've got external systems involved, it's so much more difficult to automate the testing of these guides. So we do just by necessity actually have to rest on those people who are reading and contributing the content to actually help with that. I don't think Q is unique in that respect. It's the same, whatever the example might be.
So that's in terms of being able to just throw a PR into correcting any piece of content on that.
Absolutely.
Brilliant.
Absolutely. Yep. So I think that's about it, unless folks had any other questions that we wanted to cover now. What we'll absolutely do is we'll publish this recording to the GitHub discussion, and we'll use the q-dot-lang and other Slack channels for discussion on any content or any questions folks might have. But otherwise, really happy to sort of do any sort of office hours or whatever it might be for folks who are interested in contributing and want to get started. That would be great. Looks like we have a question come in. Would there be a plan to validate at minimum syntax? That is a very good question. I'll try and pronounce your name is perhaps Eli. Apologies if I've not pronounced that correctly. Oh, great. That was a very good guess by me. I'll just read out the question. Would there be a plan to validate at minimum syntax? And the example does produce an output at all. I think it's an excellent question. I think it's a very tricky, nuanced answer. So, for example, Jonathan, I'll perhaps lean on our Terraform example, where there are so many moving parts to the end-to-end example. Eli, to answer your question, to sort of validate that we get something out at the end is really very, very involved in terms of, from a testing perspective, doing it in an automated way. That's not to say, though, that it's an all or nothing thing. And perhaps that's what you're hinting at in your question. We already have quite a lot of, full automation on the alpha.qlang.org documentation. What I think we can do, and Jonathan, you and I have talked about this in the past, is ways in which we can leverage that in a sort of a piecemeal way. So if someone has a block of Q code, for example, we could have some annotation that automated tooling then checks that that block of Q code actually is formatted properly, and that it's valid, etc. So just to help a tiny bit along the way. Yeah. Eli, I think it's going to be hard to do everything, but I'm just seeing you've sent something else. I understand it's tough to say. Yes, quite. Yeah. So we'll use tooling absolutely as and when we can. Just for now, things are a bit scrappy. We're just getting started with this. I think we can and should port that tooling to be used here when we can. It's all open source in the qlang.org repo. Jonathan, you and I talked about ways in which we could do that. I think we'll need to think a tiny bit harder about how we do it in a piecemeal way, but it should be possible. Are you looking for contributions on such tooling? Absolutely. Eli, very happy to do another session on that where we walk through if you've got ideas that you want to bring, 100%. If you want a bit of a glimpse at how we do things on the qlang.org side, it's quite a bit more involved on the qlang.org side. We absolutely don't have to use what's on qlang.org. If somebody else wants to bring a different idea for how we do things here, 100% open to that and would really welcome such contributions. No, that's absolutely perfect. A really good question. Thank you.
yeah, I think getting a sort of a thing where we could perhaps show that we have got the formatting done correctly on the queue side, with some sort of escape valve for somebody giving an example of some badly formatted queue that's intentionally on these. I can think
Yeah.
that might just come in, but that's obviously a corner case. I think that might be a really useful thing. But I think that in terms of being able to spot errors in the end-to-end flow of these, that I think that's a big order of magnitude bigger problem. And because of
Yeah, no, I think Eli makes a good point. Rather than throw the baby out with the bathwater and just say we're not going to validate anything. If
Yeah.
people can choose to opt in to this should be valid queue, should be valid go, etc., it's a good starting point from a syntactical perspective. Just we cut out a category of errors in that situation. I think so. We're very, very happy for folks to work on tooling for that side of things.
I think I would just say last of all, I'd love folks to get involved.
Yep.
It's really, really validating to get queue things in front of people's eyes and go, I think this thing can work like this. Would other folks find value in doing it like that? I think it'd be enormously useful and valuable to get that feedback and to get other people coming and just going, here's some more content, here's some ideas of how to do this. And I think people will, I think we just got a snowball of people driving content, people correcting currently a lot of errors in my sort of things that are there. Folks, just chuck those PRs in, folks, really.
Yep. Wonderful. Okay, is there anything else, Jonathan? Anybody else on the call that we want to chat through now? Otherwise, look forward to seeing folks at either office hours or whatever else, other conversations around this, or the material for qlang.org as well.
Fab.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers, folks.
See you all soon.